That night, a starving, desperate girl tied the Apache down his arms and legs, stretched tight, his muffled screams filling the room while the knife shook in her hand. She leaned in the blade, hovering above his body, her breath ragged. At sunrise 30, Apache warriors rode hard to her door, and fear hit her like a hammer. If you felt the tension in this moment, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and stay tuned because the story only gets more intense from here. You'll starve if you keep it, girl, and you'll die if you give it away. That was the kind of thought that hit Eliza square in the chest as she stood in her dirt-floored kitchen, staring at the small, hard piece of bread resting on the chipped plate. The last one. She'd been saving it since morning, telling herself she could make it last through the day if she was careful. Her house, if it could still be called that, creaked in the wind like an old ship that had been left to rot. The boards were dry and split, the windows patched with rags, and the roof sagged under the weight of every storm. Folks from town had offered to buy the place more than once. "Sell it, Eliza," they'd say. "You'll have enough to eat, maybe even a proper bed again." She always shook her head. It wasn't about the money. That house was all she had left of her parents. Selling it would have been like burying them a second time, and she couldn't bring herself to do that. The world outside didn't care much if a girl like her ate or starved. The prayers hadn't brought food or money or warmth, but they'd given her just enough courage to wake up each morning. That morning, she carried the bucket to the well, the bread tucked in her pocket. The cold air stung her face, and her bare feet picked their way over the hard ground, every step sharp as broken glass. Her stomach growled loud in the quiet, but she bit her lip and ignored it. The bread wasn't hers by right. She'd begged for it the day before in town, standing by the mercantile with her head down, waiting for someone kind enough to hand over a scrap. An old woman had slipped it to her quick. It was small and hard, more crust than loaf, but to Eliza it was worth more than a gold coin. If she did, there'd be nothing left. So she kept it wrapped in a rag, only daring to nibble a corner when her belly hurt too much to bear. Most times she just held it close to her face, breathing in the smell, fooling herself into thinking that was enough. She meant to stretch it into 2 meals, maybe 3 if she was careful, though the hunger in her gut made her want to swallow it whole. Still, she told herself she could wait, that she had to. But halfway to the well, she stopped dead. A dark stain marked the dirt, fresh and glistening. Blood. Her stomach dropped and her eyes followed the trail, step after step, until she reached the stone wall of the well itself. There he was. A man. Not just any man, an Apache. His chest rose and fell in ragged gasps. One hand clutched tight over his side where the blood seeped through the other, reaching weakly toward the wooden bucket that hung just above him. Eliza froze, heart pounding. Every story she'd ever heard about Indians came rushing back. Scalpings, raids, barns set ablaze. Folks in town said you were a fool if you so much as looked an Apache in the eye. Yet here he was, slumped against her, well too weak to even lift his own head. His lips moved cracked and bleeding, the word barely more than a whisper, "Water." Her first thought was to run, pretend she'd never seen him. But her legs wouldn't move. It was a man on the edge of death. His eyes, though clouded with pain, were steady and pleading, the same way she imagined her father's might have looked in his final hours when the fever had taken him. Eliza's throat tightened. Still fear clawed at her. If anyone from town saw him here, they'd say she was harboring the enemy. They'd drag her out, call her a traitor, maybe worse. Helping him could mean the end of her. Her hand brushed against the lump of bread in her pocket, and she thought about how thin her arms had gotten, how her stomach had burned the night before for lack of food. She thought about how she'd sworn she'd make that peace last. Her breath came out shaky, and before she could talk herself out of it, she pulled the bread from her pocket, broke it in half with trembling fingers, and crouched beside him. "Here," she said, her voice so soft it surprised her. "Take it." He blinked slow, as if unsure whether he'd heard right. She lifted the bread to his lips, and he took it like a man drowning takes air. Chewed slow, swallowed hard, eyes never leaving hers. Eliza grabbed the bucket, lowered it, and hauled up water with all the strength her small arms could manage. She tilted it carefully against his mouth. He drank deep, the sound of it harsh and desperate. Some of it spilled down his chin, darkening the dirt at his side. When he finally pulled away, his breathing was less jagged. For just a moment, the hardness in his face softened and gratitude flickered in his eyes. Then his head sagged back and his body went limp. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She shook him gently, panic rising. "Don't you die here," she whispered. "Not at my well." She looked around, certain someone would come riding up the road, certain the neighbors or the marshal would see and know. Fear burned through her, but something deeper held steady, an old, stubborn resolve. She couldn't leave him out here to die where anyone might find him. Gritting her teeth, Eliza grabbed his arm and tried to lift. He was heavy, heavier than anything she'd ever carried, but she dragged him inch by inch toward the house. The boards creaked under her as she pulled him inside, shutting the door quick so no eyes could see. She dropped beside him, chest heaving, sweat dampening her hairline. Her whole body ached, but she stared at him lying there on her floor, the blood still seeping from his side, and she whispered a shaky prayer she hadn't meant to say out loud. "Lord, don't let me be a fool for this." The room smelled of dust and iron, of blood and old wood. The last piece of bread was gone, and Eliza's stomach twisted with hunger. The first thing Eliza noticed when she went back to check on him was the smell. It wasn't just the sweat and dust she'd expected from a man who'd been out there on the ground. It was sharper, heavier, a smell her father used to say no man should ever carry if he meant to live much longer. Infection. She set the bucket down and knelt close, brushing back the folds of his torn shirt. The sight nearly made her stomach flip. The wound wasn't a scrape or a cut from a fall. It was a hole, dark and angry, the edges singed. Her hand trembled as she reached to feel around it, and she almost pulled away when her fingers found the hard shape lodged just inside the torn flesh. A bullet. Her chest tightened. She hadn't thought much about bullets except when she'd heard them crack in the distance or seen the holes they left in fence posts, but her father had. He used to say a bullet that stayed inside a man was a death sentence unless someone pulled it out. She heard his voice in her head as clear as if he were sitting beside her. "You leave it in, Eliza, and it'll fester. You pull it wrong and the man'll bleed out. You gotta be steady, girl. Steady." She sat back, pressing her hands into her lap. He'd die if she didn't take it out. But if he woke while she had the knife in her hand, what then? She'd heard the stories all her life. Apaches fierce as wolves killing settlers in their sleep, taking scalps for trophies. What if he opened his eyes, saw her bent over him and decided to end her right there? She shut her eyes for a moment. Letting him die wasn't in her. It wasn't what her father would have wanted her to do. When night came, she moved him onto her father's old bed. It had been empty since the sickness took her parents, the sheets washed and folded, but never used again. She tied strips of cloth around his wrists and ankles, fastening them to the bedposts. It felt wrong, cruel even, but she told herself she had no choice. If he woke in the middle of it, she'd need him still. Her hands shook as she slipped a folded rag between his teeth, securing it so he wouldn't bite through his tongue. She lit the lantern low, set her father's hunting knife on the table, and whispered a prayer. The cut was quick. Her breath held the whole time. The blade slipped into the flesh at his side, and he bucked against the tie's eyes, snapping open. He tried to yell, but the rag caught the sound, turning it into a muffled cry that made her chest ache. His whole body strained, but the cords held him fast. "I ain't here to kill you," she said, though she doubted he could hear past the pain. "Hold still. Just hold still." Her fingers worked fast, steady, the way her father had taught her, reaching for the bullet she'd felt earlier. He twisted again, sweat pouring down his temples, eyes wide with fear. For a moment she thought he'd break the ties, and her heart pounded so loud she could barely hear her own breathing. Then she felt it hard and round under her fingers. She pinched it with the tip of the knife, drew it out slow, and the sound it made when it dropped into the tin bowl by her knee was sharp as a bell. "Done," she whispered, dropping the knife beside it. The rag muffled his heavy breathing, and she could see the fight draining out of him. She pulled the cloth from his mouth and laid a hand gentle against his forehead. "It's over. You'll live." He looked at her eyes still wild, and for a moment she thought he might spit some curse at her. But the fight in him gave way to exhaustion, and his head fell back. By the time she cleaned the wound and bound it tight with strips of boiled cloth, his breathing had eased. She sank into the chair at the bedside, her own arms trembling, and let the lantern burn low until her eyes closed without her meaning them to. When morning came, the smell of broth filled the room, though it was little more than water onions and a few wilted greens she'd scrounged from the garden patch that hadn't yet died in the heat. She fed him spoon by spoon, his eyes half closed, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Dakota," he said when she asked his name. She raised an eyebrow. "That's so. You don't look much like a chief." His lips curved the faintest bit, though the pain was plain in his eyes. "I am Chief," he insisted. Eliza gave a short laugh, shaking her head. "Well, Chief, best not let anyone find you here. They'd string me up same as you." Day by day, he grew stronger. She caught him watching her. Sometimes his eyes dark and unreadable, and she couldn't tell if he was measuring her kindness or weighing her foolishness. At night, when she thought he slept, he sometimes hummed soft, low tunes that made the hair on her arms prickle. One evening after the sun had slipped behind the hills, he sat on the step with a small, pipe-shaped piece of bark in his hand. He lifted it to his lips, and a thin, haunting sound rose into the air, carrying farther than she thought possible. She listened from the doorway, not knowing whether to feel comforted or unsettled. When he finished, he set it aside and walked back inside without a word. Eliza lay awake long after staring at the ceiling, wondering if she'd been a fool to trust him, or if the sound of that tune meant something she couldn't yet see. At first light, the answer came. She stepped outside to fetch water, still rubbing sleep from her eyes, and froze. The earth itself seemed to tremble under the steady beat of hooves. She looked up the road, and her breath caught. Apaches. Dozens of them. 30 men on horseback, dust rising behind them, moving straight toward her little house. She clutched the bucket tight, her heart slamming against her ribs, and the thought that flashed through her mind was as sharp and plain as the morning air. What have I done? They came like a rolling storm, the thunder of their horses shaking the ground so hard, Eliza thought the old boards of her porch might give way. She didn't run. She couldn't. The bucket in her hand felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and all she could do was stand there staring as the riders closed in. Her eyes darted to the man inside her house. Dakota, he'd called himself. Chief, he'd said. Was that the truth? She wasn't sure. But the way those men rode, the way they moved in a tight line without a word wasted, she knew he mattered to them. They pulled up sharp dust swirling around their horses' legs, eyes sharp as flint and just as cold. One of them barked a word in a tongue Eliza didn't know, and another pointed toward the door of her little house. Her mouth went dry. She thought maybe they'd kill her right then and there just for harboring one of their own. She gripped the bucket tighter, though what good a bucket would do against 30 men she couldn't say. The door behind her creaked, and she turned to see Dakota leaning weakly against the frame, one hand pressed to his side. His face was pale, but his eyes were steady. He raised a hand, palm open. The change was instant. The riders relaxed the tension like a bowstring suddenly loosed. Several of them dismounted, quick rushing forward to steady him. They spoke low and urgent, their voices carrying the weight of men who'd thought their leader lost. Dakota's gaze flicked toward Eliza, and he gave a faint nod. She didn't know what it meant, not really, but the men turned from her like she wasn't the enemy they'd expected. One of them, a broad-shouldered warrior with a scar down his cheek, spoke in rough English. She help him. Dakota's lips moved, his voice quiet but firm. Yes. The scarred man looked at her a long time like he was deciding whether to believe it, then gave a short nod. Then she, friend. Eliza let out the breath she'd been holding. The rest of that day passed in a blur. The Apache warriors brought food, dried meat roots, a pouch of cornmeal, and laid it on her table like it was nothing. Eliza hadn't seen that much food in months. She tried to protest, her voice stumbling over the words, but they waved her off. By nightfall, her little house was fuller than it had ever been. Men sat cross-legged on the floor, some tending to their own cuts and bruises, others speaking low in their own tongue. She moved among them like a ghost, her bare feet quiet on the creaking boards, fetching water, handing out strips of cloth for bandages, showing them where her father's few medical supplies still sat. They treated her with a strange kind of respect. Not like a child, not like a servant, but something in between. When she helped one young man wrap a gash on his arm, he gave her a look so gentle it nearly undid her. It was the kind of look she imagined a brother might have given if she'd ever had one. That night, sitting at her father's old table, Eliza felt something she hadn't felt since before the sickness took her parents. Belonging. Like she had dozens of brothers, dozens of fathers, all watching over her in their own quiet way. Dakota lay back on the bed, his color slowly returning. She sat beside him, dabbing his forehead with a damp cloth. "You should have left me," he murmured, voice rough. Eliza shook her head. "Couldn't." His eyes opened dark and serious. "You risked your life. You know who hunts me?" She hesitated. "Soldiers." He gave a small nod. "Men of government. They say we must leave our land." I said no. His jaw tightened. "They want my death. Not only mine. All my people." The words sat heavy in the air. Around the room, some of the warriors who understood English shifted their eyes, hardening their faces tight with anger. Eliza looked down at her hands. She thought of the stories she'd been told her whole life, how Indians were dangerous, how they took what wasn't theirs, how they couldn't be trusted. But sitting there listening, all she felt was the weight of sorrow, and maybe something worse, hopelessness. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. She just kept dabbing his brow, her hands steady, even though her heart wasn't. For 3 days, the warriors stayed. They brought more food, enough that Eliza ate until her stomach no longer ached with emptiness. She laughed once, a sound that startled her when one of the younger men tried to show her how to braid horsehair into rope and only succeeded in tangling it worse than she could have managed. At night, she treated the wounded. Cuts, bruises, a twisted ankle. Her father's lessons came back like old friends, her hands moving with a confidence she hadn't known she still had. Each man she helped gave her a small nod of thanks, and each nod felt like another stone lifted from her chest. But the air was never easy. Whenever the talk turned to the white soldiers, voices grew sharp, eyes flashed, fists clenched. Hatred ran deep in those men, and Eliza felt it pressing in thick as smoke. She listened quiet, her stomach knotting, not knowing what side she was supposed to stand on. Dakota saw her worry. One evening, as the fire burned low, he said softly, "You gave me bread. You gave me life. That makes you family." She didn't know how to answer. The words warmed her, but they scared her too. Family meant belonging, and belonging meant being pulled into a fight that wasn't hers. On the 4th morning, as the sun climbed over the hills, the warriors gathered outside. Their horses stamped the ground, eager for the trail. The scarred man who'd spoken to her first stepped forward. "Come with us," he said. "You safe with us. You eat, you live." Eliza's heart squeezed. She looked at the little house behind her, the sagging roof, the broken shutters, the walls her father had built with his own hands. It wasn't much, but it was hers. It was all she had left of her parents. "I can't," she said quietly. "This house. It's my home." The man's eyes softened, and he gave a slow nod. "You strong." Dakota appeared then, leaning on one of the younger men for support. He stepped forward, his face solemn. From around his neck, he pulled a cord strung with a small stone worn smooth with age. He held it out to her. "You saved me," he said, his voice steady now. "Now I give you this. You are part of us." The warriors stood silent as Eliza took the necklace, her fingers trembling. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so seen, so valued. For the first time in years, tears filled her eyes, and she let them fall. "I ain't never had family," she whispered. "Not since Mama and Papa." Dakota placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "Now you do." The hoofbeats came then, faint at first, then louder, rolling over the hills like distant thunder. Eliza stiffened her eyes, flying to the horizon. Dust rose in the distance. The sound of hoofbeats rolled closer, steady as a drumbeat, and Eliza's stomach tightened. She clutched the stone necklace at her chest, the gift Dakota had just given her, and for a brief moment she told herself maybe it was only more of his men returning from the hills. But deep down, she knew better. From the edge of the woods, a pair of eyes watched. The man had been there since dawn, crouched low among the trees, a rifle resting against his knee. He'd seen enough to know the girl wasn't just some orphan scraping by in a broken-down house anymore. She'd been taken in by the Apache chief himself, given a token of belonging, and that made her dangerous. He spat into the dirt, his lip curling. Little fool, don't even know the trouble she's brought down on herself. By nightfall, when the Apache warriors had ridden out to scout the ridges, the man slipped back through the brush to where two others waited with their horses. They whispered quick, mean words and their faces hardened. The plan was simple. Take the girl, make her talk if she knew anything worth hearing, and if not, make sure she never got the chance to. The house stood dark against the rising moon, only a faint glow from a lantern inside showing that someone was home. Eliza had fallen asleep at the table, her head resting on folded arms, the necklace still against her chest. The day had been long, and though she'd meant to stay awake, her body had finally given in. The first blow came against the door loud enough to snap her awake in an instant. Before she could rise, the wood cracked, splinters flying as boots crashed through. Shadows filled the room, rough hands grabbing her scream, barely leaving her throat, before a calloused palm clamped down hard. She kicked and twisted her small fists, pounding against a chest like a stone wall, but it did no good. One man shoved her to the floor, and the necklace slipped free, glinting in the lamplight. Another reached down and ripped it from her neck. The stone hit the boards with a sharp clatter. He held it up, sneering. "Well now, what's this Chief Dakota's little pet?" She tried to bite his hand when he reached for her again, but he only laughed low and cruel. "Ain't got teeth enough, girl. You'll pay for that." The words were worse than the grip on her arms. They carried the promise of something she didn't want to think about. Her heart hammered so hard it drowned out everything else, even the sound of the other men overturning what little she had in the room. Outside, tied to a post, one of the warriors' horses snorted, sensing the chaos, but no help came. She was alone. Miles away, Dakota sat by a fire with a few of his most trusted men. He hadn't been able to rest, not truly, though his body begged for it. Something gnawed at him, sharp and insistent, a warning he couldn't shake. His hand went to his chest, to the twin of the stone necklace he'd given Eliza. It felt cold, colder than the night air around him. His jaw tightened, and he stood without a word. The others looked up, concern flickering in their eyes. "Chief," one asked. Dakota's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "She is in danger." No one questioned him. Within minutes, they were mounted, riding hard toward the little house that had become something like a shelter for them all. By the time they reached it, the moon was high. The place looked wrong even from a distance. The door hung loose on one hinge, swinging in the wind. Smoke rose faint from the chimney, but no light glowed inside. Dakota's horse skidded to a stop in the yard, his boots hitting the dirt before the animal had fully halted. He pushed the door wide and stepped into silence. The table was overturned. The few dishes Eliza owned shattered across the floor. A chair lay broken, one leg splintered. He crouched, his fingers brushing against something small and smooth. The necklace. He closed his hand around it, his throat tightening. The room smelled of sweat and fear, the kind of smell he'd known too many times before. Behind him, one of his men cursed under his breath. Another kicked at the broken chair, his face twisting with fury. Dakota said nothing. His eyes stayed on the little stone in his palm. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the weight of iron. "They have taken her." For a moment the men stood frozen. Then the scarred warrior stepped forward. "We will get her back." Dakota nodded once, slow. "We must. She is one of us now." He slipped the necklace into his pouch, his jaw set tight. He would not let the girl's kindness be repaid with death. Outside, the night stretched quiet and dark, but in the distance a wolf howled. Dakota lifted his head toward the sound, and in his heart, the fire of resolve burned brighter than the flames of the camp behind him. Whatever it cost, he would find her. The men saddled quickly, keeping the noise low. They moved like shadows across the valley floor, every hoofstep muffled by the earth. Dakota rode at the front, his mind fixed on the small, crumbling fort he knew lay to the south. It was the kind of place men with orders, but no conscience, liked to hold too far from town for anyone to ask questions close enough to the main road to keep supplies coming. Miles away inside the fort, Eliza sat on a cold cot in a room that smelled of damp stone and rusted iron. The walls wept moisture, and the only light came from a barred window too high for her to reach. She'd cried at first, the kind of silent tears that burned her cheeks, but she'd stopped now. There was no one to hear, and she didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing she was scared. The heavy door groaned open and a man stepped inside. His boots echoed against the floor, each step slow and deliberate. He wore a uniform, though the shine on it had long since dulled, and the way he carried himself told her he was used to giving orders no one dared question. He leaned down close enough she could smell the tobacco on his breath. "You want to live, girl?" She clenched her fists in her lap and stared back at him without answering. "Then you'll do as you're told," he said. "When we bring Dakota here, you'll tell the officers he came to you that he spoke of raising his people against us. You'll say he plans to break the peace treaty. You do that, and maybe we let you go." Eliza's stomach twisted. She thought of Dakota's words, the steady tone when he'd told her the truth. The truth doesn't care who speaks it. It just is. She shook her head, small and stubborn. The officer's eyes narrowed. He straightened his mouth, curling in a thin smile. "Stubborn little thing. That can be fixed." He left the lock clanging behind him, and Eliza pulled her knees up to her chest. She whispered under her breath a prayer she wasn't sure she believed would be heard. Dakota's party moved fast, cutting through the trees to avoid the main trail. Twice they spotted riders ahead, government scouts keeping watch. Each time they circled wide, moving through gullies and dry creek beds, their horses trained to silence. When the moon slid behind clouds, they dismounted and led the animals, their moccasins soft against the dirt. The scarred warrior glanced at Dakota. "They expect us. Too many guards for a fort so small." Dakota nodded. "They fear the truth. That is why they hold her." Inside the fort, Eliza listened to the sounds beyond the walls, the shuffle of boots, the murmur of voices. Sometimes she caught words enough to understand more than they realized. "They'll hang him quick, make it look clean," one soldier muttered. Another replied, lower, uneasy. "Don't sit right with me. The treaties kept peace. My brother's farm, he'd be dead without it." The first hissed back, "You want to keep your post, you'll keep your mouth shut." Eliza held on to that small crack of doubt. Not all of them believed the lies. Maybe, just maybe, someone inside would stand with the truth when the time came. By dawn, Dakota and his men reached the ridge above the fort. They crouched low, studying the walls. Smoke curled from a chimney, and 2 guards paced the front gate. Beyond the walls, the flag hung limp in the still air. Dakota's eyes narrowed. "They are ready, but not for us all." He turned to his men, his voice calm but firm. "We go careful. No mistakes. We get her. Then the truth must be spoken." The scarred warrior frowned. "What if she is gone already?" Dakota's hand went again to the necklace. "She lives. I feel it." In the fort, Eliza's door opened once more. A younger soldier stepped inside. This time his eyes darting like a boy caught in mischief. He carried a tin cup of water and set it down on the floor. "You should drink," he said quietly. She eyed him wary. "Why?" He shifted his weight, glancing toward the door. "Because I don't think you'll get another chance today." Her throat ached with thirst, but her pride made her pause. "They told you to watch me." He shook his head. "They told me to make sure you didn't die before the officers got here. But I heard what the captain said to you. I don't think Dakota's the man they say he is." Eliza studied him. He looked no older than 16, maybe 17. His hands trembled as he shoved the cup closer. She took it, drank slow, then set it down. "He's not. He's trying to keep peace. They want to kill him so they can start a war." The boy swallowed his eyes, flicking to the door again. "I believe you, but believing ain't enough here. You keep your head down. I'll do what I can." She nodded, a small flicker of hope lighting in her chest. Outside, the guards leaned on their rifles, unaware of the eyes watching from the ridge. Dakota laid out the plan in low words. 2 would circle left, 2 right, drawing the guards' attention. He and the scarred warrior would slip through the rear gate where the shadows lay thickest. The men moved like ghosts, slipping into position. Dakota's heart beat steady each step, carrying the weight of both duty and something deeper. The girl had risked everything for him. He would not leave her in the hands of men who fed on lies. Back in her cell, Eliza pressed her ear to the wall, straining to hear. She thought she caught the faintest rustle, like leaves stirred by a wind that hadn't reached the fort. Eliza held her breath cheek against the damp wall, eyes wide in the dark. Something was coming. Not the sound of boots or barking orders, this was quieter, like something moving on the wind. It was enough to make her hope, though she didn't dare speak the word aloud. Out beyond the gate, Dakota crouched behind a pile of barrels stacked low against the side of the fort. The others were in position. 2 had already moved toward the front to draw attention, while he and the scarred warrior waited for the back signal. A stone clicked against the wall ahead. It was faint, but clear. The signal was given. Dakota moved. The back gate had a weak hinge. One of the scouts had checked it earlier. With slow hands, they pried it just enough to slip through. Then came the hard part, getting past the interior wall without drawing fire. But the front worked just as planned. Suddenly, a shot rang out. Then another. Over there, a guard shouted from the front wall. Men scrambled, boots thudding on wood, voices rising, and the calm of the fort cracked like glass. Inside her cell, Eliza jerked upright. That was gunfire. And yelling. Not drills, not patrol shifts, something real. She ran to the door and shouted, her voice raw. "Dakota." No one answered, but she thought she heard another shot closer this time and the sharp crack of splintered wood. The officer burst through the door, face red with panic, gun in hand. He grabbed her by the collar, dragging her toward the hallway. "You're coming with me," he snapped. She kicked and thrashed, but he was too strong. Down the hall, another door slammed. More gunfire. Screams. She was shoved into the main room near the front barracks, the oil lamp still lit. That's when she saw him. Dakota. He stood in the entryway, covered in dust and sweat, his eyes locked on hers like he'd been looking for nothing else in the world. But behind him, others moved. The Apache warriors fanned out, covering him with rifles drawn. The officer shoved her forward and raised his pistol, grabbing her by the neck and pressing the barrel hard against her temple. "Drop your weapons or she dies," he shouted. The room fell still. Dakota didn't move for a long breath. Then slowly, with a motion as controlled as stone shifting in a riverbed, he raised one hand, palm out. "Hold." The Apache froze. Eliza's legs shook. The officer's hand on her was trembling now too, whether from rage or fear she couldn't tell. The pistol pressed harder against her skin. Then she remembered the lamp. Right there, burning hot glass chimney glowing. She didn't think, just moved. With one swift twist, she grabbed the lamp from the table and slammed it to the floor. The oil spilled fire, flaring fast across the boards. The officer cursed, stumbling back. In the chaos, he pulled the trigger. Dakota lunged. The shot rang out. Eliza fell, hitting the floor hard. The world spun. She couldn't tell what happened next, only heat and the sound of men yelling, feet scrambling, more gunfire. When she blinked her eyes open, Dakota was above her, one hand clutched at his shoulder where blood ran thick. He dropped to his knees beside her, eyes full of panic. "Eliza," he rasped. "Are you hurt?" She blinked. No, I don't think." Then she saw the blood soaking his sleeve. "You're shot," she whispered. Behind them, the battle exploded. Apache warriors stormed through the main room, ducking gunfire, returning with sharp, clean shots of their own. Smoke filled the air, fire licking along the wall from the fallen lamp. One of the younger soldiers ran forward to help, yelling, "I'm on your side! Don't shoot!" The scarred warrior grabbed him, yanked him aside just as another guard fired a wild shot that hit nothing but wall. In the chaos, another group burst through the front. This time soldiers, but not the ones giving orders. These men wore the same uniforms, but they weren't shouting like wolves in a fight. They were steady, purposeful. Their leader raised his voice. "Stand down. Captain Warner is under arrest." The officer holding Eliza had been caught trying to escape through the north door. He was tackled hard, his weapon kicked away. Dakota slumped against the wall, his breathing ragged. Eliza crawled to him, pulling her shawl off to press against the wound. "You're gonna be okay," she muttered. "You saved me. Now I save you." He didn't smile, but his eyes met hers, and they were clear. The room slowly fell quiet. Smoke still hung in the air. Men groaned. Guns were gathered, fires smothered with blankets and dirt. A lieutenant from the new group stepped forward, looking over the mess. His voice was low but clear. "We've known something was wrong here for weeks. This place wasn't following orders. Word came down that civilians were disappearing, that someone was misusing their post." He turned to Dakota, who tried to stand but staggered. "You're Dakota." Dakota nodded. "I'm sorry we didn't come sooner." Dakota looked at him hard. "Then you come now. That is enough." The lieutenant swallowed. "We'll see justice served." From outside, dawn was breaking. Eliza looked around the ruined room, her hands still shaking. She turned to Dakota and asked softly, "Is it over?" He looked back at her, quiet for a moment. "No. But today, truth was stronger than lies, and that for now was enough." The battle was over, but the quiet afterward felt heavier than the noise had. Smoke still clung to the rafters of the small fort, and the smell of burnt oil and gunpowder seemed to hang on the air, refusing to leave. Men were moving slow, tending to the wounded, dragging the dead into a line outside the gate. Dakota lay on a rough wooden stretcher, his shoulder wrapped tight in bandages that already showed spots of red. Eliza walked beside him, one hand clutching his larger one, as if letting go would send him away forever. Her cheeks were streaked with dirt and tears, though she didn't seem to notice. When they set him down in what had once been the commander's quarters, she knelt close, her small fingers trembling as she brushed damp hair back from his forehead. His eyes fluttered open, dark and steady, even through the pain. "You did well," he whispered, his voice rough. "You are a true warrior now." Eliza's throat tightened. She shook her head. "I was scared out of my mind. I just grabbed the lamp. I didn't even think." "That is courage," Dakota said softly. Not the absence of fear, but acting despite it. Her eyes filled again, and she pressed his hand tighter. "Don't you dare leave me. Not now." He gave the faintest smile. "Not yet." Outside, the lieutenant who had taken command after the traitors were subdued stood with a folded piece of paper in his hand. He looked grave, the kind of man who knew the weight of what he carried. When Eliza came to fetch water for Dakota, he stopped her. "Miss," he said quietly, "I need you to hear this. It's a letter from Colonel Morrison. He wrote it the day before he was killed." She froze, her eyes wide. "Colonel Morrison," Dakota told me, "he was the only one trying to make peace." The lieutenant nodded. "That's true. And in this letter he names the men who set him up. They dressed as Apache warriors, painted their faces, and ambushed him. The captain who held you here was one of them. They planned to blame Dakota and break the treaty so the army would have cause to drive his people off their land. Her stomach twisted. She remembered the captain's sneer, the way he'd pressed the pistol against her head. The lieutenant's jaw tightened. "We'll deliver this letter to the territorial governor, along with your testimony. Between the two, no one can deny what really happened." She swallowed hard. "Then they'll know Dakota's innocent." "That's right." He paused, his eyes softening. "You've been brave, girl. Braver than most men I know." She ducked her head, cheeks burning. "I just wanted to do right, same as Papa would have wanted." By afternoon, the prisoners were bound and set under guard, their faces pale with the knowledge of what awaited them. The fort felt less like a prison now, and more like a place finally letting go of its lies. Word spread fast. Apache riders who'd been waiting in the hills came down wary at first, then steady as they saw Dakota alive. They filled the yard, their presence quiet but commanding, the sound of their horses shifting echoing off the walls. At sunset, the ceremony began. Dakota, though weak, insisted on standing. With the scarred warrior steadying him, he stepped into the yard where the Apache had formed a circle. Eliza walked at his side, her small frame nearly hidden among them, yet every eye followed her. Dakota raised his hand, and the circle stilled. "This girl," he said in English, so the soldiers nearby could hear, "gave her last bread to a dying man. She gave water, care, and courage when no one else would. She risked her life for truth." He reached into his pouch and pulled out a necklace stone and beadwork older and finer than the one she had lost. He held it out to her, his voice steady despite the pain in his shoulder. "She is now our family." Eliza's breath caught. Her hands shook as she reached out, the necklace cool against her skin as he placed it around her neck. One by one, the warriors stepped forward. Each touched her shoulder or her hand, their eyes meeting hers with respect she had never known before. Not pity, not curiosity, respect. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. The scarred warrior spoke low as he passed her. "You are not alone anymore." For the first time since her parents died, she believed it. Later, as the sky turned crimson and the sun sank low, she stood beside Dakota on the ridge above the fort. The land stretched wide and endless before them, the horizon painted in red and gold. "Do you regret not going with us?" Dakota asked gently. She shook her head. "I can't leave the house, Dakota. It's all I have left of Mama and Papa. It ain't much, but it's theirs, and I promised myself I'd keep it standing." He nodded slowly. "A home is more than walls. It is memory. It is spirit. You honor them by keeping it." She turned, looking up at him. "But what if they come back? What if the soldiers try again?" He rested his good hand on her shoulder. "Then you will not stand alone. We will be near. And you now carry more than bread and water. You carry truth. That is stronger than any bullet." She looked back at the sunset, her fingers brushing the stone at her throat. It felt heavy and warm, like the weight of belonging, like the weight of hope. The air was quiet except for the horses shifting below and the faint murmur of men speaking low. Eliza breathed deep, letting it fill her chest. She thought back to that first morning at the well, to the moment she chose to give away her last piece of bread. She had believed it might be the end of her. Instead, it had been the beginning. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "One small kindness," and everything changed. Dakota heard, and for a moment, his solemn face softened. "Yes," he said, "sometimes peace begins with bread." The two stood in silence as the last light faded, the promise of tomorrow brighter than the fire of yesterday's battle. And for the first time in a long while, Eliza felt her heart steady. You know, the more I think about Eliza's story, the more it sticks with me. A little girl, hungry alone, clutching the last piece of bread she had in this world, and instead of keeping it for herself, she gave it to a man everyone told her to fear. That single act of kindness, something so small yet so brave, changed everything, not just for her, but for an entire people. It reminds me that sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that don't seem to make sense at first. Helping a stranger who could have been an enemy. Risking your own safety because deep down you know it's the right thing to do. Eliza didn't have much, but she had her heart, and that turned out to be stronger than fear, stronger than hunger, even stronger than the hatred around her. And Dakota's side of the story, how a proud leader wounded and hunted found hope in the compassion of a child, teaches us something too. That peace, trust, and family can come from the most unexpected places. This isn't just a story about survival or about a girl and a chief. It's about the power of truth and how one small act of humanity can ripple out to challenge lies, break down walls, and give birth to something better. So I want to hear from you. What part of Eliza's journey spoke to you the most? Was it her courage, her loyalty, or maybe her stubborn refusal to give up on the house her parents left her? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd really love to know how this story touched you. And remember, sometimes peace really does begin with a single piece of bread.